Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. It is then only logical to ask, is the United States, which is the spiritual successor of the Roman Republic, destined to share its same fate? In this video, we will cover an overview of the history of the late Republic, identify the rising issues, and then see if these problems share correlations with the United States of today.
Why should that change?
Because the Roman people are suffering, because slaves have taken all the work, because nobles have taken all the land, and the streets are full of the homeless and the starving.
A nation with a history and legacy as storied and impactful upon Western civilization as Rome has had parallels drawn with whatever the leading country of the day has been. Indeed, much ink has been spilled by people asking if America is the new Rome for decades. The question still stands, though. Will the United States story terminate in a sequel to the death of the Roman Republic and the birth of the empire, with the rise of a new series of Caesars? It's easy, and has been common, to ascribe links between current events to actions that occurred in the late Roman Republic. Further, when expedient, politicians or commentators will often label individuals with the names of characters involved in the death of the Republic. The reality is, though, that such surface-level correlations are a form of fool's gold, shiny and easy to grab for, but lacking any real value. The real question is, are the economic and social problems of the late Roman Republic that its government was unable or unwilling to handle comparable to the situation the United States finds itself in today? There are two key points to be made here. The first is that it's a question of conditions and catalysts. The former is more important than the latter because a catalyst can be anything that lights the match to the dry kindling that is the conditions. Additionally, since it may only be a historical rhyme, we recognize that the exact nature and order of events may not have direct one-for-one parallels. However, when taken as a composite, are the economic and social problems and concerns reflective of the issues that the United States confronts? Further, is the constitutional republic of the United States prone to the same failures that plagued the Roman Republic? Before we begin, we need to have a general comprehension of the status of the Roman Republic in its final century. The last part is critical to note because the actual end was not a singular event, but rather a series of escalating crises that occurred over decades, with the pendulum swinging between Republican rule and periods of tyranny. There are historians who dedicate their entire careers to just a few years within this period. So for our purposes, we will try to remain at a 40,000-foot level and observe the broad social and economic trends, changes, and problems. There is a common consensus that the death of the Roman Republic began with the death of the Gracchi brothers in the 130 and 120s BC. Geopolitically, at this point, the Roman Republic was the dominant force in the Mediterranean. Rome had emerged triumphant in the previous decades from the Punic Wars, which was a series of conflicts with Carthage that were akin to the world wars of the time. These had ended with the complete destruction and razing of Carthage, leaving Rome as the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean. In the following decade, it continued unchecked expansion in Spain, Greece, and eventually the Near Middle East. The resultant economic changes from these shifts had negative and positive impacts for different classes of Roman society. Roman citizens, traditionally, had often been rural, freeholding farmers. Over this period, though, many of these citizens found it no longer economically sustainable to operate their farms. There are varied reasons for this that include plentiful and cheap agricultural products shipped in from conquered areas, large commercial farms worked by slave labor, and partible inheritances. The key point, though, is that many, unable to compete, sold their farms to wealthy individuals and families, and moved to the city to work as wage laborers. This was exacerbated by both sizable native-born population growth, as well as an influx of migration from within the Republic's domain, leading to large numbers of urban poor. Aggravating this economic turmoil was various political corruption with state contracts, jury verdicts, and elections becoming entangled in bribes between the political nobility and wealthy commercial class. Into this stepped the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Using the deteriorating situation of the lower classes, the brothers rode the wave of discontent to political office by attempting to move legislation that would see the state doling out parcels of land to poor Roman citizens. The citizens could neither sell the land, and if they no longer would or could work it, then it was returned to the state. It should be noted that the land was not taken from the wealthy elites, but rather confiscated from Rome's Italian allies. This solution created problems that will later see metastasize in ways that would further erode the Republic.
20,000 deserving families will be given farms on the public lands around Capua.
The brothers also pushed other reforms to the system. These included reforming juries by composing them of the middle and lower classes to prevent noble manipulation, centralizing bidding for public contracts to increase oversight, as well as introducing a grain subsidy for the urban poor of Rome. Additionally, they pushed legislation to force the Senate to act more in the public interest rather than for themselves, as well as reforming various corruption laws. One of the primary issues that arose was how the brothers pushed through their reforms. Normally, legislation would originate, be debated, and passed in the Roman Senate, which was made up of the wealthy nobility. However, the Roman constitution allowed for an assembly of the people to be called, which could override the Senate. The Gracchi used this uncommon method to rally the rural dispossessed to vote through these motions, as well as to strip certain members of the Senate who voted to block the reforms of their offices.
If you prefer, I could always bypass the Senate, call an assembly of the people, and you can put your arguments to them. Fine orator like yourself might just persuade them.
Their growing political power represented a threat to the position of the Senate. Eventually, following a failure of the Senate to block Tiberius from seeking office, a group of senators led a militia group to attack and kill Tiberius as well as a number of his followers. Later, Gaius was summoned to defend himself in the Senate after one of his supporters killed someone else in the streets. The Senate then instructed the consul to eliminate Gaius. The consul did so with a combination of militia forces and mercenaries from Crete. Following Gaius' killing, many of the brothers' supporters were subjected to summary judgment and execution. The real legacy of this moment was less about the specifics of the issues that the Gracchi brothers used to ride to power. They were important, but perhaps more important were two other concerns. One was that the established interests in government were more concerned with protecting their own claims, positions, and authority than solving problems that even they recognized were real. Second, for the first time in a long time, violence and extra-legal murder in the case of Tiberius was used to solve political disagreements amongst Romans. It created a precedent for government to use military force against those it deemed its enemies, even those who had the ostensible rights of Roman citizens. This, in turn, drove opposing politicians to take measures to protect themselves from the threat of both legal and extrajudicial violence. Even writers of the time acknowledged that a proverbial Rubicon had been crossed, and that force was both an acceptable means of achieving political ends and perhaps an expedient one as well. Previously, we referenced the social wars. This was another defining moment, although it lasted years, of the late Republic. The name is somewhat misleading. It is a bastardization of the Latin name, but correctly translated means War of the Allies. Although Rome had conquered much of the Mediterranean, it didn't do so with only Romans. Early in its history, as the Republic had expanded throughout the Italian peninsula, numerous cities and states had become subjects of Rome. Over the centuries, certain rights had been granted to them. They weren't Roman citizens, but had an increased level of privileges relative to other vassal nations. Further, the Italian allies were a critical source of manpower for Rome's conflicts. By even the late 200s BC, there were 3 Italian soldiers for every Roman. The crux of the dispute centered over the Gracchi brothers' land redistributions. Much of this public land was in title only, having been ceded by the Italians centuries before, during their defeats. Yet, it had been lived on and worked by the Italians for entire generations following those events. The forced removal of Italians and their families by the Romans led to resentment and anger building up. Additionally, the lower class Italians had also been dealing with what they felt was unfair rulings by Roman magistrates that hailed from a far-off capital. These magistrates had little in common with the locals and often promoted their own interests. Further, wealthy Italians who were able to do business in the provinces had reduced status back at home. Eventually, this spilled into open rebellion during the Social Wars after the assassination of a pro-Italian people's tribune. Rome was caught by surprise and initially made little headway. The Roman logistical and military machine slipped into gear, though. The scale of the conflict was substantial, and the state suffered financial strain as it raised hundreds of thousands of troops to put down the rebellion. Additionally, the manpower needs were so great that the Romans relaxed the standards for who could join the army. Previously, soldiers had come from the small landholder plebeian class of citizens. Now, though, they opened enlistment to the freedmen of the proletarian class. As this force lumbered to life, the Romans also used diplomacy as a weapon. They sought to lure some fence-sitters and even rebels back into the fold with the promise of Roman citizenship, which, in many cases, was accepted. The Romans eventually won the war, and over the next decades, Roman citizenship continued to spread through Italy. Through a modern lens, the expansion of suffrage by creating a massive new pool of voting citizens would be considered a good thing. However, here though, it actually had the effect of debasing what it meant to be culturally Roman. Roman life had been governed by an unwritten code for centuries called the Mos Maiorum, which were behaviors, practices, and principles that governed social, political, and military life. The massive addition of citizens who did not share the same value set, especially when it came to acceptable actions for politics and the use of military force, began to degrade the social fabric that united those who were considered Roman. Additionally, the result of settling a political dispute between those who were all now considered Romans through warfare further reinforced the trends set during the time of the Gracchi that violence and force were acceptable tools to use against domestic opponents. During the Social War, a successful Roman general named Sulla came to prominence. Following the conclusion of the war, street violence in Rome continued in connection with political disputes. This eventually led to Sulla fleeing the city to take command of an army he had been assigned to lead against Mithridates of Pontus in the east. The upcoming war was a prize of riches and spoils for the Roman general who would command, and numerous noble senators wanted the position. Political intrigues by his enemies, as well as a betrayal by another general named Marius, who ostensibly was his friend, led to legislation stripping Sulla of command to give it to Marius. Sulla, who was popular with the rank-and-file soldiers after the Social War, convinced them to march on Rome in order to allegedly free it from tyrants. His opponents were members of the populist faction of the time and had used their armed gangs to influence the popular assembly into overturning the normal Senate governance for their benefit and deposing the elected consuls. Sulla, who was one of the deposed consuls, was in effect fighting to restore the Republic from mob rule, although his personal interests aligned with the restoration of senatorial supremacy as well. Once Sulla had occupied Rome with his troops, he extorted the Senate into outlawing his political enemies and stripping them of their Roman citizenship, as well as retroactively legalizing his march on the city. Further, he created laws restricting the power of the People's Tribune and Popular Assembly to pass laws. All legislation was to originate from the Senate, and then any popular votes will be done by economic class, with the wealthiest carrying the most weight. The financial strains on the economy from the Social War, and the need to appease the mob led to him canceling 10% of all debts and putting interest rate controls on new debt into effect.
For the coming year, all rents on low dwellings in the city will be paid in full.
Sulla still had a problem, though, that was rooted in the consequences of the social war. Many of the soldiers in his army were landless poor that had been admitted because the manpower needs had been so great. They had been promised spoils from the campaign against Mithridates, and Sulla needed to deliver. He left Rome to execute that campaign, and in his absence, nobles angered by his coup retook control. Using their own military forces, they murdered political opponents, undid Sulla's laws, and declared him a traitor as he had done to them. Eventually, Sulla returned victorious from the east, and his veteran legions defeated the armies of his enemies. The Senate appointed him dictator, a term that had a much more specific meaning in the Roman constitution than today's definition, and he retaliated by having his remaining opponents in the thousands killed. Sulla eventually resigned the dictatorship, but not before implementing more reforms that reverted power back to the aristocracy and the Senate, such as returning jury composition to the nobility. He retired to the countryside and died several years later in 78 BC of natural causes. Sulla's actions and legacy were an important part, and have been argued, the true death of actual republican governance. It built upon the use of violence and murder, as had happened to the Gracchi, and the fraying of the social codes and behaviors of what it meant to be Roman that occurred in the post-social war period. However, it opened a new Pandora's box, as it served as a proof of concept that an individual with ambition and an army loyal to them could use military force to achieve their political ends. It set the example for leaders who were already coming of age during this conflict, one of whom would put the final nail in the Republic's coffin. The Republic, as a formality, limped on for another couple decades. Although the Senate still existed, it was more and more common for politics to be dominated and controlled by strongmen generals with loyal troops that could be called upon if needed. These included what became known as the First Triumvirate, which was an informal alliance between Pompey Magnus, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus to direct the politics of the Terminal Republic. The three balanced each other, but following Crassus' defeat and death at the hands of the Parthians, and the marriage between Caesar's daughter Julia and Pompey ending with Julia's death in childbirth, a confrontation between the remaining two was inevitable. The details of Julius Caesar's march on Rome, his dictatorship, assassination, and succession by his nephew Octavian, who would be known as Augustus, are well known and dramatized. However, it was simply the final domino in a long line that had started nearly a century before that led to a scenario in which the Republic became the empire and military might was the arbiter of governance. So, the question stands: is the United States poised to have its own Caesar rise to power? Let's first review the conditions that existed during the late Republic. These included increased growth of both urban and rural poor working as wage earners due to an influx of cheap labor and foreign goods, growing wealth inequality, corruption and bribery in the state finances and contracts, and an untrustworthy judicial system. This was all capped off by a form of government in which the upper classes, both socially and economically, benefited from the system and had no interest in changing it as they were more concerned with their own interests. Further, the values and culture of what it meant to be a Roman citizen was diluted in the aftermath of the social wars. Into this cauldron stepped ambitious nobles and senators who sought to capitalize on these issues to their own benefit. There were no functional mechanisms in place to prevent those individuals from defaulting to the basic fact of human nature that people will generally try to obtain the most gain for themselves for the least effort. This included using government and foreign policy to advance their economic and political interests. This lack of actual concern for the issues was reflected in the actions taken by the ruling aristocracy in each of these events. During the time of the Gracchi, the Senate didn't undo many of the populist economic policies the brothers pushed through. It was rather a reactionary concern that the Gracchi were a threat to the existing power structure that gave the Senate and nobles wealth and power. Sulla was not much different either. Despite pushing populist economic policies such as debt forgiveness and interest rate controls, he removed many of the laws passed to check noble and Senate corruption. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, was the rapid escalation of violence to achieve political outcomes. It started with using public mobs to intimidate voters and the Senate, to which the nobles responded by murdering them. That led to continued cycles of assassination and the use of paramilitary forces to control elections. This acceptability of using force was taken to the next stage during the Social Wars, in which the military was used against those who would soon become citizens, which blurred the lines between foreign and domestic foes. Eventually, this led to the logical outcome that larger levels of force were needed until it eventually ended in whole legions fighting each other in civil wars until a final victory was achieved. So where then does the United States in the present day fall on these issues? Any of you who even loosely follow the news have likely drawn similar parallels as we have discussed these issues. Let us first start with the economic challenges. The US hasn't been a smallholder, farm-based economy for a long time, but a more accurate correlation would be using the middle class. This economic group has been on a shrinking path over the last decades. It's for issues that are similar to those faced in the Roman Republic, with cheap foreign goods flooding US markets as rising global populations reduce the value of labor. Now, nearly 90% of the country works as a wage employee for some company or the government.
Too many slaves, you see. They've taken all the work, which causes unemployment amongst the free populace. Now, we need to create more jobs for our citizens.
This has seen an increased gap between rich and poor. The reasons for wealth inequality in the United States aren't the topic of this video, but it does exist. Further, the condition of state finances continues to deteriorate with out-of-control fiscal spending, inflationary monetary policy, and a rising and increasing deficit. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency has further shed light on the corruption and cronyism within the NGO industrial complex, with politicians and ideological bureaucrats rewarding their friends and supporters with lucrative contracts. Finally, the independence and objectivity of the judicial system has rightly come under criticism, with activist judges acting outside their authority and partisan prosecutors creating sham charges and show trials. Similar to the Roman Republic, the US system also doesn't seem able to effectively limit politicians' pursuit of their own interests at the expense of the citizenry. The wealthy and the political have become synonymous, with most members of Congress either being millionaires or quickly becoming so once taking office. This accumulation of assets then means there is no incentive to change the damaging monetary and fiscal policies that cause inflation, because their assets appreciate to match.
Frankly, I do not care whether it's the rich, poor, or indeed both that suffer.
There are politicians who, similar to those in the late Republic, come along promoting and riding waves of economic populism. Yet, it's all still for show, as the United States' most prominent socialist is a multimillionaire who owns 3 homes, and his protege rides around on private jets. Further, the other side is also surfing the same wave of economic populism by promoting its own right-leaning version. For all their policy dissimilarities, the two parties are in unison on bowing to the mob rule of the voters, who constantly demand continued gifts given to them from the public treasury.
Must please the people in some other fashion.
Build yet another temple, kill someone. The people are easy to please, not this.
This leads to another parallel with the late Republic, the perilous state of official finances. The Romans strained their ledger with the costs of the social war, and then further, as its leaders continued to buy the loyalty of the masses with bread, circuses, and even direct payments. Sulla, who arguably represented the interests of the old wealthy nobility, still fell into this trap. Modern America has seen its own finances strained by forever wars. Further, it is a system of entitlement programs that are on an unchecked exponential expansion to the point that the government is currently required to inflate its currency at over 6% a year.
Each and every citizen of Rome will be issued from the public treasury the sum of 100 denarii.
If there once was a political and economic aristocracy that cared about the greater good and country, it exists no longer. As demonstrated by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, the elite within this country have been reduced to aggrandizing themselves at the taxpayer's expense. This isn't limited to the left either. The right has its own version, to include the current president launching his own crypto meme coin. Congress is guilty as well, as seen by the number of its members who frequently trade the financial markets and somehow manage to come out ahead of index averages. Now, with power concentrated in a distant capital, only those with the right social connections or financial weight have the ability to have their interests represented. The citizenry of the United States has become equally complicit in the degradation of our civic fabric. Once, we all agreed on the same values and facts, but differed in how to solve the problems we faced. Now, we no longer possess a shared understanding of human nature or what is even real, and one side has devolved into a hedonistic moral relativism. The two camps are now applying the friend-enemy distinction to the other, and the chasm between them seems unbridgeable. The last institution is the legal system. The last years have seen a failure cascade in the trust of the judiciary and elected prosecutors. Show trials, sham charges, forum shopping, and nationwide injunctions by minor magistrates that are effectively partisan vetoes of the executive branch have eroded any remaining vestiges of respect. Additionally, the system no longer exists as a system of relief for the broad citizenry, but is only accessible and useful for those with access to vast financial resources. The United States has already opened the same Pandora's box as the Romans did with the Gracchi. Multiple attempted assassinations of a major political candidate have taken us across a proverbial Rubicon that can't be undone. The most recent attempts weren't the first occurrence, as members of the Republican Congressional Softball Team, or Gabby Giffords, can attest. However, the step of attempting to decapitate the candidate standing in for half the country will be another shot heard round the world going forward. Lastly, we arrive at the one area in which there isn't a perfect parallel, yet. That is the use of military force to seize power, terrorize political opponents, and enforce political change. There are two potential analogs. The first is that we have seen the use of federal law enforcement, which can be considered a paramilitary force, used to intimidate and even jail political opposition. Further, various state National Guards have been called out to combat mob violence and even guard the seat of federal power. The use of the National Guard is nuanced since they are ostensibly under the authority of their state governors. However, given their uniforms are so similar to active duty forces, this distinction may be lost on the layperson who only sees soldiers in the streets being used by politicians.
Martial law is in effect. A curfew is in effect. Any person found on the street after dark will be subject to summary judgment.
Now that we understand the potential parallels of economic, social, and political conditions that existed during the late Roman Republic and the present-day United States, come the important questions. Are we on the same track? It seems, given the correlations and parallels, that the answer to that question is clearly yes. The unknowable question is, will we continue down that path, or will the citizenry and their elected leaders find the resolve to avert the same end? Finally, the resultant question is, at what point along that timeline are we? I would reiterate that one-for-one parallels are not perfect, and therefore events and trends may not perfectly happen in the same order. With the available information, I would assess that we are still closer in time to the Gracchi than we are to Sulla. This would mean that a potential Caesar is even farther away. This should be cold comfort, though. True, the period of time during the late Republic, from the Gracchi to the rise of Caesar, was nearly a century. However, we live in the modern world, a time of air and space travel, the internet, and social media. Things move much faster in the present, and it is not out of the question that we could move to our own Sulla and then to the Caesars in very rapid succession. The conditions are setting in. All it takes is a catalyst to light the tinder, and our world could be turned upside down.
The Roman people are not crying out for clean elections. They're crying out for jobs. They're crying out for clean water, for food, for stability and peace.
Already, there are those who have given up on our modern republic and are embracing accelerationism, a path that promotes purposely damaging things further in the hope that we can get to the other side of an eventual breakdown faster. It may be the optimist in me, but our founders, who understood the failures of the late republic, gave us a better system for preventing the same outcome. We have, as Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. It requires us to understand the conditions that are developing, realize our responsibility in how we got here, and recognize that we can change course. But it will require sacrifice in the form of sweat and tears, so that hopefully we can avert one in blood.
Do you see?
Not clearly.
I'm not sure I can explain it in simpler terms.
Thank you for listening and honoring me with your time. Please like, subscribe, and sign up for alerts if you want to see more content like this.
Seems rather, extreme. It would be hugely expensive.
Only to those few rich men who are, and they shall have the consolation of having done something eminently patriotic.